Class, let us begin today the face on the wall. So, do you like to listen to stories? This is the preface, means introduction of the story, and some questions are here. What is your favorite kind? Detective, humorous, suspense, romance, or horror story? Do you think a patch on a wall or floor can resemble the face of a real person? Read the story to find out. Yes, sometimes it looks like. The story begins. We were talking of events which cannot be explained by natural causes at Dabney's last evening. Most of us had given an instance without producing much effect among the strangers. To me was a little man with an anxious face. He watched each speaker with the closest attention but said nothing. Then Dabney turned to him and asked if he had any experience he could narrate. He thought a moment. Well, he said, not a story in the ordinary sense of the word, nothing like most of your examples. Truth, I always believe, is not only stranger than a made up story, but also greatly more interesting. I could tell you an occurrence which happened to me personally and which strangely enough completed itself only this afternoon. So, in the beginning, we are going to talk about that there is a gathering and some events are they being talked about among the friends. The narrator is over there and everybody is asking the experiences of the life just like a story. So when the narrator's turn came, so the narrator was asked to tell about his own experience or just like a story. So the narrator began to say in just way that he had not such a story, but he had experienced recently. So he would like to share, and perhaps that occurrence, that episode occurred earlier and it got completed recently in that afternoon. So we begged him to begin. A year or two ago, he said, I was in rooms in an old house in Great Ormond Street. This is the name of the street, place. The bedroom walls had been painted by the previous tenant. Tenant means the person who was living over there on rent. But the place was damp. Damp means here wet. And there were great patches on the walls. One of these, as indeed often happens, exactly like a face, lying on a bed in the morning and delaying getting up, I came to think of it as real as my fellow lodger. Lodger means the dweller, the person who lived over there. So the story begins in such a way that there was a room, there was a house in which there was a room, and the place was Great Ormond Street. So earlier that room was on rent, taken by earlier tenant, so he had got it painted, but on account of being damp, the wall contains some of the patches. Uh, so some of the patches in which one patch appeared to be like a face. So the narrator began to look at it in the same way, and he felt that this was not the patch but a kind of face appeared over there. While there, I fell ill with an influenza, and all day long I had nothing to do but read or think, and it was then that the face began to get a firmer hold of me. It grew more and more real and remarkable. I may say that it filled my thoughts day and night. There was a curious curve of the nose, and the forehead was remarkable. So the narrator was ill with influenza, so he had nothing to do, and he kept on looking at the wall. Then the face, which was due to patch on the wall, it began to become visible, more clear and remarkable, just like a real one. So it was very curious for him that even he was able to recognize the nose and forehead. It was absolutely clear in the patch. Well, I got better, but the face still controlled me. Found myself searching the streets for one like it. Somewhere I was convinced the real man must exist, and him I must meet. I often went to places where people gather in large numbers, political meetings, football matches, railway stations, but all in vain. Vain means useless. So, when the narrator was recovered, and he began to realize that perhaps that face was familiar one, and now he began to look for that man, and even he went to such places which were crowded, just like football matches, other meetings, political meetings, and the crowd on the railway stations, but his search was useless. The search became a madness with me. I neglected everything else. I stood at busy corners watching the crowd until people thought me mad. I never looked at women, men, men all the time. The narrator says that even just like a mad person, he began to look for that face, and he neglected the women. Okay, so everybody now began to think about him that the man was really insane, and he was only trying to look for that face in the faces of men, and he never looked at women. He passed his hand over his brow as if he was very tired, and then he continued, I at last saw him. He was in a taxi driving east along Piccadilly. I then saw an empty one coming. Follow that taxi, I said, and leaped in. The driver managed to keep it in sight, and it took us to Charing Cross. I rushed onto the platform and found my man with two ladies and a little girl. So they were going to France. The narrator once he confronted that man, and he found that the man was hiring a taxi and he was going towards the Piccadilly, and the narrator took another taxi which was empty, by the way, and that taxi driver followed the earlier taxi in which the man was. Then he found that he was going to Charing Cross, and he had other persons also. It means two ladies and a little girl. So they were going to France. I hastily means quickly, purchased a ticket to Folkestone, hoping that I should catch him on the boat before it sailed. But at Folkestone he got on the ship before me and disappeared into a large private cabin. Evidently, he was a rich man. So the narrator hoped that he would be able to catch him in the boat, so he also bought a ticket to Folkestone. But the man was rich enough, so that's why he just disappeared from there, and he went into the private cabin of the boat. Again, I was defeated, but I was determined to go with him. I had only just enough for a single fare to Bologna, but nothing would stop me now. I took up my position opposite his cabin door and waited. After half an hour, the door opened and he came out. My heart beat fast. And there was no mistaking the face. Every line was the same. He looked at me and moved towards the way to the upper deck. It was now or never, I felt. So again, The narrator was not defeated at all, and he took a resolution that he would go to him, and he would really would like to meet him. So after half an hour, the door of the cabin opened and the man appeared. So the narrator began to look at the face. So each line, each gesture was exactly the same as he had seen on the patches or of the wall. So he thought that it was the time to catch him up. Excuse me, I stammered. Stammered means said very slowly while hesitating. But do you mind to give me your card? I have a very important reason in asking it. So the narrator reaching to him, and even he begged for his card for a particular reason. He seemed to be greatly surprised, as indeed well he might, but he granted my request. Slowly he took out his case and handed me his card and hurried on. It was clear that he thought me mad. So the person did not deny his request, although it was greatly surprise for him. Even he took out a card from the case and handed to the narrator, thinking that perhaps the man was mad. Holding the card tight in my hand, I hurried to a lonely corner of the ship and read it. My eyes grew dim, my head reeled, for on it were the words Mr. Ormond Wall, with an address at Pittsburgh, USA. I remembered no more until I found myself in a hospital at Bologna. Only a month ago did I return. He was silent. So when he began to read what was written, the address on the card, and it was very surprising for him, because the address which was printed on the card, visiting card, it was the name was written Mr. Ormond Wall, and address was Pittsburgh, USA. So the narrator could remember only until he was found in a hospital at Bologna, and only 1 month ago he returned from there. He was silent. It means while telling all these things, he became silent. We looked at him and at another and waited. I went back. He started once again after a moment or so to Great Ormond Street and set to work to find out all I could about this American. I wrote to Pittsburgh, I wrote to American editors, I made friends with Americans in London, but all that I could find out was that he was a millionaire with English parents who had resided in London, but where? To that question I received no answer. So the narrator tried his best. It means there were some of his friends in America who happened to be friends in London. So even he wrote to them and he demanded the queries and information about the man. So he got to know that the man was a millionaire, and he belonged to English parents, and even he resided, it means he lived in London, but where it was not clear. There was the question about it. And so the time went on until yesterday morning. I had gone to bed more than usually tired and slept till late. When I woke, I looked at once at the wall on which the face is to be seen. So the narrator was rather tired, and he reached home and he slept. But when he woke up, he looked at the wall. The face he began to watch on the wall. I rubbed my eyes and sprang up. It was only faintly visible. So the face was faintly visible on the wall now. Last night it had been clear as ever almost. I could hear it speak, and now it was a ghost of itself. But last night it was rather visible, but it was now disappearing. I got up confused and sad and went out. The early editions of the papers were already out. I saw the headline American Millionaire's Motor Accident. You all must have seen it. I bought it and read Mr. Ormond Wall, the Pittsburgh millionaire and party, motoring in Italy, were hit by a wagon and the car overturned. Mr. Wall's condition was critical. So the narrator now began to look for the information in the old newspapers, and he got such a heading in which it was written that American millionaire motor accident. So Mr. Ormond Wall was rather injured because his car was hit by wagon, and Mr. Wall's condition was critical. I went back to my room and sat on the bed looking with unseeing eyes at the face on the wall. And even as I looked, suddenly it completely disappeared. So the narrator came back again and he began to look at the face of the wall, but slowly, that face was now disappearing, and finally, all of a sudden, it disappeared completely. Later, I found that Mr. Wall died of his injuries at what I take it to be that very moment. So the narrator guessed only because of that occurrence. Perhaps Mr. Wall, because his condition was rather critical, so he must have died. Again, he was silent. So while telling the story, he became silent. Most remarkable, we said, most extraordinary, and so forth, and we meant it too. It means everybody was saying that it is rather remarkable story and most extraordinary. Yes, said the stranger. There are three extraordinary, three most remarkable things about my story. But that narrator said that, yeah, really extraordinary. There are three things about it, because regarding extraordinary and regarding remarkable. One is that it should be possible for a patch on the wall of a house in London not only to form the features of a gentleman in America, but also to have a close association with his life. It means the face was not only which was appearing on the face of the wall because of the patch, so it belonged to a gentleman who was living in America, but also there was a close relation to his life. Next is, science will not be able to explain that yet, and another factor is that science cannot explain about it. Another one is that the gentleman's name should bear any relation to the spot on which his features were being so curiously reproduced by some unknown agency. Is it not so? And even unknown agency also recognize that face. So if not so, we agreed with him. Soon the narrator of the amazing experience rose up and said, "Good night." Just as he was at the door, one of the company asked him what he considered the third most exciting thing in connection with his deeply interesting story. "You said three things, you know," said he. So when the narrator of the story began to move from there, and while telling only the two things, extraordinary things about the story, so one of the companions asked him, "You had just told us that there were three things important, three things extraordinary. What was the third?" "Oh, the third thing," he said as he opened the door, "I was forgetting that the third extraordinary thing about the story is that I made it up about half an hour ago. Good night again." So the man who was leaving, he said that the extraordinary thing about the story is that he had only made this story half an hour ago when he came here, and he wished again good night. So this is the story which has been taken from the face on the wall by E.V. Lucas. Thank you, students.